I was gonna do a quick video on this thing called I think they call it body language and how to read body language. But the trick with that is that it's different depending on the language and the culture that person's from. So like their expressions are different, the meaning is the same, but it's slightly like different based on like the language and stuff like that. Sorry, I'm recording a video. So like if somebody was like, I don't know how else to say it, like, okay, let's say that I'm Korean, that's my first language, and my body language or my facial expressions is going to reflect that, right? Like the way that I respond to situations and how I interpret social situations will be slightly different because my first language and the culture that I was grown in was in Korea. I don't know why they call it a culture. They also use the same term for bacteria. It's where you propagate the growth of genetic information. That's what that means. Okay, so if you don't know what culture means, culture is the study, or at least the description for a society or a specific region within a group of populations or a group of people where they exchange information in the same way. So, well, information and resources and the propagation of resources, that's called a culture. So, how people are making use of said resources, how to continue to keep those resources, and how those resources are beneficial to each person's in that group and to other people who do not live in that group or in that area. So that's called culture. How people start expressing themselves and facial expressions and body language is going to be different based on religious background, ethnic background, and even financial background. So that's a giveaway for a lot of people and how they assess other people. That's how a lot of people judge other people by. They make assumptions of that person based on those information to get demographic information. Again, that's only good for business and economics. So like economics is the study of continuation of trades and services. So how people maintain those products and or services they provide for themselves and others in exchange for other products and or services, including monetary transactions. So that's economy. So culture, economy different, but a lot of people's cultures are dependent on the economy, so the services that they can provide to outside of the said culture. Otherwise, they're gonna be at risk for being invaded or being decultured or like being converted. So what actually ends up happening is that if there is a group of people who live in a certain region and they don't provide any value, right? They don't provide any products or services. There's no use for having said group still living and participating with the rest of the global populations to anybody. That means that they are no longer required to survive. So if that happens, they're gonna be automatically start being ignored, or they're gonna be denied said resources due to the fact that their own resources are lacking and it's not enough to maintain trades and economies outside of that specific region. And a lot of it's going to be used for protecting said region. Right? So that's where the military and the government come in when they're trying to protect their resources. So their trades and economies, products and their services, they're trying to protect that so that other people don't get in on it and try to invade and govern that area themselves, because those people are deemed by other humans, this is instinctual, as unnecessary or no longer fit for that position or job because it's interfering negatively with other people's cultures. So now they can no longer function. There's a conflict, right? They can't function anymore because of this group of people because they are competing for resources, right? And it could be multiple cultures being affected by one culture, or it could be one culture being affected by multiple cultures. In either case, you need to expend your resources into maintaining the area, protecting the area, and continuing the growth of said culture and economy so it's relevant to other people, including the people who live there and are no longer living there but have family living there or friends living there. So those are trades and cultures and economies and all that kind of stuff. Apparently people don't understand this. Some people need a PhD to understand this, to be fair. The PhD being like people go to school and get awarded a PhD for studying this. This is like research-based data. That's part of culture. So how people are educated and how they exchange said educational information and how they recognize that person to be educated. Legal system, part of culture. Businesses, part of culture. But they don't make up the culture in and of itself. What actually ends up happening is that when you are from a certain culture, their facial expressions are different because each culture has its own standards and values that they abide by that propagate their own economies and their own products and or services. So if that's what's happening, that means that how people respond socially is going to be different based on what is valued or prioritized in that culture. So if people value, let's say, there's two cultures, one of them value being kind, right? So when you're kind, your responses that you're going to, your feedback is going to be positive. So if you're kind, that means people are more willing to talk to you and they're less willing to ignore you because you have something that is of value and that people want to protect or keep having it going in that culture. It's part of their integrated into their culture. The other culture values physical prowess. So like they like strong people who can lift the strongest things, who can lift the heaviest rock, who can pull the most cars by hand, by strength alone, right? So you're gonna get positive feedback if anything you do or your attributes are associated or coincides with that physical prowess. So if you are pulling, right, a car and people can see that, that means people value you because in that culture they think that is a good thing and that's helping their economy and their trades and their schooling and everything. Whereas with the other culture, they prioritize not something physical, biological, but more like innately functional. So it's a behavioral trait that has more to do with genetics and socialization more so than ability. The other one values ability. The other one values what was it, like social technique, right? Like physical ability versus social technique. Those are two different things, right? Does that being kind lead to you having a better body? No, those are mutually exclusive. So just because you're kind doesn't mean that you're gonna get a better body. Just because you have a good body doesn't mean you're kind. It doesn't mean you're mean. It doesn't really mean anything other than you have that physical ability, right? Regarding the value of your said trait in that culture, they're gonna prioritize people based on what they value, right? So again, if you're living in a culture where something is deemed socially unacceptable, and yes, there are universally socially unacceptable behaviors regardless of what culture you're from and which culture you're in, but these socially unacceptable behaviors corresponds to negative or unethical results. So if whatever you're doing is going to hurt yourself or other people or both, it's going to be deemed socially unacceptable. So that's where that whole socially unacceptable stuff comes from. If you are socially unacceptable, what ends up happening is that you get negative feedback. People's body language of which you are attuned to, right, is going to be hurtful. It's going to be negative. They're going to be devaluing you. They're going to tell you that you're no longer valued in society. The problem is that some people, because they're abnormal and they're actually devalued, don't want to know that. They don't want to see that. That's where the whole defense mechanisms start kicking in. They don't want to understand this, and they don't want to know that they're not valued in society. And when they get that kind of feedback from other people, they're telling them you need to do something about that. Instead of doing something about that, they think it's not them, it must be somebody else, right? Because that means that they are at risk for, they're getting at risk for being vulnerable, that no one's gonna be willing to protect them or befriend them or do business with them. And that is what keeps a person's life going. So their life is essentially over, if that is true. And people get very, very the negative responses that they receive from other people are supposed to be an indicator of how well you're doing in that culture. But some people, because they're abnormal and they're socially unacceptable, behave negatively towards that and do that negative behaviors towards other people in an attempt to kind of fit in and kind of blend into their environment, to say that I too am like those people, I too agree with those things, and I also know those things are not okay. So now I'm gonna do that to you because I don't understand why they're doing this to me. I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. But as long as I do what they're doing, it should be fine. No one else can tell that I don't know what's going on. That's what a lot of people do in response to that kind of behavior. Anyway, my point is, it's hard to teach body language because if you don't know what these expressions mean and why people are eliciting said responses, then you're gonna have a hard time. And not always is it because it's clear cut and they're literally just telling you word for word what it is. Some people have problems. Some people's expressions are a little funky. Some people like to say things in a very negative tone. Some people have mental health issues that clouds their judgment or their ability to tell you things clearly. Some people are shy. They don't like to express their emotions or thoughts or feelings. Some people are, I don't know, just innately antisocial, right? Some people don't like to express their facial expression. They like to do things to cover their body language, to not let people know what it is that they're thinking or doing. Some people just don't like to participate in that kind of stuff in public with people that they don't consider to be valuable, just on initial superficial assessments. AKA, they're not important enough for them to say anything to. So that's where that whole thing comes in. That's why it's hard to teach people body language, because if you don't know whys and the whats and the hows and the whatnots, then how are you supposed to be able to assess that and understand what those things mean? Right? It's like, okay, it's like trying to teach people idioms. Like, why is it called an idiom? Why are these phrases used? Why do people say those things instead of saying what's actually going on? Which could be a mouthful. It could be very wordy and lengthy, which people want to save time on. They don't want to sit there for 10 minutes trying to explain to you it is the way it is, when they can just use an idiom saying birds of a feather flock together. It is what it is. When it rains, it pours. You know, people say it that way. Instead of having to explain to you everything, they're hoping that you'll pick it up. Right? You start thinking on your own and understanding what they're trying to tell you. Okay? And sometimes you can ignore it. It's kind of like in one ear out the other, like river flows and it's just words, it's like dust in your eyes or something like that. Because the problem is some people, again, are not very smart. They could be wrong in their assessment. They could be saying things out of emotion, aka mental illness, not exactly out of logic or judgment or assessment or their own personal thought associated with their personality traits. So those could be reasons as to why they're not telling you things the right way, or it's completely off and you can just ignore it and they're wrong and they're just saying that because of whatever other reason. Yeah, sorry to mention this. I should maybe have mentioned this before. Mental illness is a umbrella term to use to describe people who cannot function normally due to their irregularities in their emotional responses. and they let their emotions affect their thinking. So their emotions affect their thinking and their behavior. There's no separation of it. That's called a mental illness. So I'm upset, so everybody else has to be upset as me, and people have to know that I'm upset. I'm not gonna do anything until I'm not upset anymore. That's a mental illness. And that happens without actual interference in their external environment. As in, no one's actually threatening them, no one's actually hurting them, no one's actually, like, they're not being put at risk, no one's actually, like, damaging their property. Right? If those things aren't happening and they're responding that way, everything's fine for them. But they're responding that way, that's a mental illness. I like to think that nobody responds like that for no reason, but it does occur. It happens quite frequently, which is why it's an illness. It's a sickness, you know, like being jealous. It's a sickness. You just shouldn't be feeling that. You should be responding that way. And you shouldn't have those desires associated with those emotions. Called an illness. But that's what that is. I don't know how to teach body language because it's like, okay, how are you supposed to tell that person they feel disgusted? They look the disgusted face. They're giving you that disgusted face because what you're doing is immoral and absolutely unacceptable socially, but you don't understand socially acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and you don't understand morality. You don't know what morality is, so how are you going to understand or comprehend why they're responding that way? Right? Like, even if somebody explained it to you, morality is this, they can read you out a description or definition from the dictionary, you're not going to understand it because you're like, I don't know what morality is. What's morals? What's immoral? What's amoral? What's moral? What's the wrong thing? What's the right thing? I don't know what you're talking about. Right? It's like, if you don't understand that, then your social life is going to suffer because you're not understanding when people think that way about you. Do you understand that? Like, you don't understand why people don't like you or approve of the things that you're doing, which is social rejection. Why are you so socially rejected? If you don't understand what is socially approved and what's socially unapproved, right? Like, you can't even recognize that. Even if somebody described it to you, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable, you can memorize those things. You can practice. Those are fine. A lot of people end up doing that because they're taught that those are not okay. They may not understand it, but as long as they do those things that are okay and practice at it, it should be fine. Does it affect that person? Yes, it does, because they don't understand it. Like, it's like talking to a wall or something. Like, they're empty-headed. Again, another idiom. It doesn't mean that they really literally have nothing in their head, in their skull. There's a brain there, it's functioning. Even though it may not look like it. And there's, like, what do you call it, like, the water in your brain and all that kind of stuff. It's connected to your spinal cord and all that, just fats and neurons firing, all that stuff. You're not actually empty-headed, but the idiom, a saying, empty-headedness, means that you have nothing going on inside your brain that is relevant or helpful to anyone, including yourself. That's what that means. So that's called being empty-headed. So again, I can't teach people behaviors or social skills and tips and tricks until you understand this kind of stuff and why this is and what that means. And if you can't understand it, then how am I supposed to, like, explain it? I could literally spend the next 20 years of my life trying to describe that for you, right? Teach you this, but you're not going to understand it even if you experience the same thing a million times over. Because to you, it's meaningless, right? You don't understand this because you see it, you know something's going on, but you don't understand why this is happening or blah, 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 blah. Maybe you should go back to school and get a doctorate or maybe even just an undergrad degree in philosophy. That might actually help with the moralities and the ethicalnesses and the social stuff. I mean, you meet a lot of classmates, you see a lot of students, you see the professors, how they behave. That should give you enough cues and kind of build it in you to be able to say that, hey, I kind of am starting to grasp. Like, think of yourself as a toddler, first learning how to walk and learning how to use blocks, you know? Like, you got the circle block goes into the circle hole, and then the triangle block goes into the triangle hole, and then the plus shape block goes into plus shape hole, and then you kind of like learn how to use your fingers to grasp it instead of like using your mouth or just like sitting there and like shoving the blocks in your mouth and sucking on it or something like that. Instead of doing that, you can like you learn how to like use your arms and your fingers to grasp at an object and place an object in the corresponding order. You know, when you're like a toddler or an infant, you start learning how to do that kind of stuff, like your body coordination movements and everything. As you get older, it gets more sophisticated. You know, it's no longer physical objects, but mental objects. It's no longer mental objects, but it's social objects. It's no longer mental or physical representations, but the understanding of said metaphysical representations. Is this clicking in the head for anyone? I don't know. I see this problem all the time. People are very skilled, some people are incredibly talented, but they don't understand anything. They're empty-headed. They learn how to do things, and that's all they do. It's like they're bacteria or something. They're like, I know how to do this like a robot. I learned this. This is the right way to do things. Yeah. Look, I can move my arms now. If I can move my arms in the right order at the right time, it might even do something. Like, that kind of stuff. But yeah, body language, the basics. Smile is happiness. Frown is sadness. Scrunched eyebrows means anger. A disgust is like, kind of like that. And, this is, when somebody's a grrr, it's like bare teeth, is aggression. Nodding means yes. Shaking your head means no. This is very basic stuff. I don't know how else to say it.